James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start by addressing some of the points raised by Craig Foss, where he was saying that Labor are voting against $100 million of extra funding, which does seem to contradict the press release that was put out saying that the current spend at the border is about $100 million and that this new tax would raise about $100 million. So is he saying that in fact costs are going to inflate to that this new tax covers 100 million of that? I am assuming that he misspoke, as he did about a number of things during his speech, and that this is in fact just covering the additional $100 million that is currently being spent. Secondly, related to that, the 4.7 million operating funding that's going to customs and the 24.9 over 4 years going to biosecurity and the 2 million capital funding going to biosecurity, as I understand it, that's on top of the $100 million that's currently being spent. Does that mean, therefore, that the $100 million revenue that's expected to be raised by this new tax won't actually cover the full costs? Because the current costs are about 100 million, and then if we add that 27, 28, 30 odd million, that means that spend will go up to about 130, just over 130 million, and the tax is expected to raise 100 million. So I just wanted to clarify if this new tax is expected to cover all expenses or just current expenses, and then where is the additional funding coming from if it's not? Second of all, Mr. Chair, sorry, I just wanted to gently remind the Labor Party and Annette King that, as she says, that we'll be voting with the government on the bill tonight, that a few weeks back, Labor voted with the government on the MP remuneration bill, a bill which contained a fairly complex piece of algebra that literally no one who voted for it understood, and completely took it on faith that it would do roughly what the government said it would, despite the government not actually being able to provide any kind of information about it actually doing, what it was intended to do. So this kind of thing, it seems, happens a fair bit round here, but thank you for the point. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, I wanted to speak particularly to, given that we are taking this all as one piece, to Clause 2, which is Clause number 1, the title. This Act is the Border Processing Arrivals and Departures Levy Act, and just to pick up on a theme from earlier, that we might want to consider some other options, because the dictionary definition of a tax is a compulsory payment to government to raise revenue levied on income, property, or goods and services. And the service may include entering or leaving the country and getting your underwear patted down while you're doing it, depending on whether you see that as a service. Some other words that we might want to use here, in addition to tax or levy: tariff, toll, excise, duty, fee, imposition, impost, exaction, assessment, tithe, or payment. I think the point being that the argument about whether to call it a levy or a tax is frankly redundant. In broad category terms, it is a tax, and we should sort of move on to whether we think that this is of any substance. I think the argument about no new taxes and whether this is a broken promise and so on, I mean, it's a fair one to have if the government said going into an election that they would raise no new taxes, and then they are raising new taxes. Then you could argue that they won the election on false pretenses, along with things like running a surplus and so on. But it does kind of buy into the narrative, and the attacks on the government for raising this additional form of revenue does buy into the narrative that government raising revenue to cover its costs is somehow a bad thing. Actually, it's not all the time, and there are times when we need to do this to cover our costs. And as I said in an earlier speech, when the government cut the top tax rate for high income earners, what it did was it actually meant that revenue was going to be running below costs for many years to come, and they could have actually been running a surplus ever since. So, in terms. Thank you. Mr Chair.
James Shaw.
I won't take too much of your time, Mr Chair, but just to say that to complete the thought that the narrative around whether taxes are good or bad or anything else, this one, and the reason why we're supporting it, we feel is actually a good one because it locates the cost with the users, and it is transparent and it increases accountability. Because rather than have it funded out of general taxation, it means that the revenue can rise and fall along with passenger numbers. So the cost is directly related to the activity, and it means that transparency around this is greater. So if we are going to be raising new taxes, to us this looks like a good one, and so we will continue to support it because we've not. I mean, process issues aside, which are shocking, and generally the Greens are against pushing things through under urgency that are not urgent, and this does not seem in any way urgent, that we're in favour of this bill. Haven't seen any real substantial arguments as to why we shouldn't pursue this course of action. But we do want some answers to those questions about whether this is $100 million worth of new funding or additional funding, and then whether the new funding that was announced in those press releases, if that's on top of that $100 million, does that mean that that this tax itself isn't covering the full cost of border security and customs and biosecurity? Thank you, Mr Chair.